The air was heavy with dust as the train screeched to a halt. Hungarian prisoners, weary from weeks of transport across a continent torn by war, stumbled out into a glaring American sun. Their boots sank into foreign soil, and, for the first time, silence overtook the men who had once marched in lockstep through the streets of Budapest. They expected ridicule, perhaps violence, or, at best, a cold indifference. Instead, something stranger awaited them, a contradiction they had never been prepared to see. The camp gates loomed, guarded not only by white American soldiers, but by men with darker skin, uniforms pressed, rifles steady. To the prisoners' eyes, it felt like an impossible image. They exchanged glances, some smirking in disbelief, others frowning in unease. The world they thought they understood seemed to crack in an instant. Axis propaganda had filled their ears for years, stories of inferiority, of hierarchies set in stone. Yet here, thousands of miles from home, those narratives collided with reality. The dissonance was deafening. Inside the camp, the atmosphere was clinical and ordered. Barbed wire coiled like steel serpents. Watchtowers cast long shadows, and barracks stretched into lines of rough geometry. Yet the focus of every Hungarian prisoner that morning was not on the fences or the guards' rifles, but on authority itself. They whispered among themselves, how could it be that African-American soldiers stood not at the margins, but in command? One anecdote passed quickly through the ranks. As the prisoners were counted and cataloged, an African-American sergeant paused to light a cigarette. The gesture was small, ordinary, but it carried an unsettling weight: confidence, calmness, ownership of the space. A Hungarian lieutenant, his pride eroded by defeat, looked away, unable to reconcile what he had seen. The silence lingered longer than the smoke. This was not the war they had imagined, not the America they had been warned about in lectures and propaganda leaflets. Here, reality confronted them not through slogans, but through lived contradictions, the sight of men whom their ideology dismissed, now holding the authority of command. And so the story begins not with gunfire, but with the quiet collapse of certainty. A world once thought unshakable crumbled, not under bombs, but under the weight of an unexpected truth. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? The camp yard fell silent when the first black officer appeared. A tall African-American lieutenant stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his uniform crisp despite the dust that clung to the morning air. His voice carried authority measured, firm, and unshakably clear to the Hungarian prisoners. It was as if time stalled. They had braced for anger, for derision, perhaps even cruelty. What they received instead was discipline and calm authority delivered by a man their old world had told them could never exist in such a role. Some prisoners reacted with disbelief. One young Hungarian, barely 20, whispered to his comrade that it had to be a performance, a staged display meant to unnerve them. Others stood stiff, eyes darting nervously, their thoughts clouded by propaganda that suddenly rang hollow. A captain among them, once proud in his Royal Hungarian uniform, tried to smirk, but his hand trembled as he adjusted his cap. The contradiction was unbearable. The empire he had fought for was collapsing. And here he was, saluting a man his leaders had labeled unworthy of respect. The lieutenant read out assignments with efficiency, his gaze steady. He ordered the men to line up, to drop their belongings for inspection, to prepare for medical checks. There was no cruelty in his tone, but neither was there softness. His command was natural, unforced the weight of years of training and earned authority. The guards obeyed his signals without hesitation, white and black soldiers moving seamlessly under his leadership. That, perhaps, shocked the prisoners more than anything else. Americans themselves accepted his rank without question. An anecdote spread that night in the barracks. A group of prisoners claimed they had seen the lieutenant quietly correct a white corporal during roll call, and the corporal had nodded, even apologized. To men raised in a rigid system of hierarchy and racial superiority, the image was haunting. Was this America's true strength? Not merely its weapons, but its ability to defy the divisions that Europe had fought so bitterly to preserve. As dusk fell, the prisoners replayed the scene in their minds. Some muttered in defiance, insisting it was a humiliation tactic. Others stared into the fading light, silent, caught in a whirlpool of doubt. For the first time since capture, the arrogance of certainty slipped away, replaced by a gnawing question they dared not voice aloud. Had everything they believed been a lie? The day ended not with violence, not with hunger, but with a clash of symbols, a salute reluctantly given, a command firmly obeyed, and the crumbling of an ideology before their very eyes. For years, Hungarian soldiers had lived beneath the shadow of propaganda. Axis broadcasts, posters, and officers' lectures painted African and African-American people as weak, uncivilized, incapable of discipline. This narrative was not just rhetoric, it was woven into every speech, every classroom, every street corner rumor. By the time these men found themselves behind American barbed wire, such ideas were as familiar to them as their own uniforms. Yet with each passing day in captivity, the fabric of those lies began to unravel. The first cracks came during drills, when Hungarian POWs were marched from barracks to work details. It was often African-American sergeants who gave the orders. Their voices were strong, precise, and impossible to ignore. They enforced discipline not with cruelty, but with consistency. Some prisoners whispered that these men moved with the same authority as German field marshals. Others scoffed, insisting it was a show, but gradually, the evidence-mounted authority here did not bend to the categories of race. It bent to competence. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Szeged, confided to his bunkmate that he could not stop watching the African-American guards during inspections. He noticed the respect in the way younger white soldiers responded to them, the lack of hesitation in following their commands. That, he said, was more disarming than any rifle. His diary, later confiscated by censors, described the experience as a mirror turned upside down, to him. The camp itself seemed designed to unteach the lessons of the Reich. Even ordinary moments carried weight. At mealtimes, African-American cooks handed out rations with the same authority as their white counterparts. When a dispute broke out over a double portion of bread, it was a black guard who settled the quarrel with a firm glance and a swift decision. The Hungarian prisoners obeyed, not because of the color of his skin, but because his authority was unshakable. For men conditioned to believe such obedience impossible, the moment was quietly revolutionary. The gossip spread in low voices at night. "Have you seen how they carry themselves?" one prisoner asked. Another, more defiant, muttered that America was simply mocking them. Yet a third, older soldier, his hair already turning gray, spoke softly of something far more unsettling. Perhaps we were the ones deceived. His words hung in the air, heavier than the barracks' wooden beams. The propaganda had promised certainty, but in the stillness of captivity, those certainties fractured. Each salute to an African-American officer, each order carried out without resistance, became another hammer blow against the edifice of ideology. And so the men began to wrestle with a new truth that their defeat was not only military, but moral, for some. The realization cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Morning in the camp began with a whistle sharp enough to slice through dreams. Hungarian prisoners shuffled into lines, eyes bleary, boots dragging across the gravel. At the head of the yard stood not the white officers they half expected, but African-American sergeants holding clipboards, their shadows long against the rising sun. Commands rang out, clipped and efficient. The roll call proceeded with a rhythm so precise it almost resembled a military drill for the POWs. The scene was a jarring inversion. Those they had been taught to dismiss now shaped every detail of their lives. Daily life unfolded under this new order. Work details were assigned, some men sent to clean kitchens, others to repair fences, still others to load supply trucks bound for nearby towns. The sergeants managed each shift with authority born of habit, their voices calm but firm. Mistakes were corrected swiftly, but rarely with cruelty. A prisoner who dropped a shovel received no blow, only a curt instruction to pick it up again. Such treatment startled men who had expected mockery or violence. In place of brutality, they found discipline and order. It was in the small, repetitive acts of routine that the greatest shocks emerged. A Hungarian officer, once accustomed to giving orders, stood in line for soup while a black cook ladled out his portion. He muttered under his breath, but he took the bowl nonetheless. Another prisoner, tasked with sweeping near the guardhouse, overheard white and black soldiers joking together, their laughter easy, unstrained, to him. It was as if a wall he had always believed unbreakable simply did not exist here. Anecdotes spread quickly. One day, during mail distribution, an African-American guard handled letters with unexpected care, even pausing to help a prisoner sound out the words of a letter written in broken English by a relative. The gesture was small, almost invisible amid the daily grind, but it lodged itself in memory. That evening, in the barracks, prisoners debated whether such kindness was genuine. Some argued it was a trick, a tactic to soften them. Others, quietly, admitted they had never seen authority expressed with such humanity. Yet the shocks were not always gentle. When two Hungarian soldiers quarreled over stolen cigarettes, it was a black sergeant who stepped in. His reprimand was sharp, his posture unyielding. The fight ended instantly. That night, whispers circled he had controlled the situation without a fist, without shouting, simply by commanding respect. It was authority stripped of spectacle, undeniable in its effect. Day by day, routine became revelation. The prisoners' world narrowed to the camp, but within those fences, their understanding of hierarchy fractured. The propaganda of superiority grew brittle against the grindstone of lived experience, and in the silence before sleep, many lay awake, realizing that the defeat they faced stretched far beyond the battlefield. The cracks in old beliefs widened not in speeches or battles, but in the tiniest of human exchanges. A guard offering a cigarette, a smile exchanged across the lunch line, a nod of respect after a well-done task to Hungarian prisoners. These moments cut deeper than gunfire. They had been told that African Americans were incapable of dignity or leadership. Yet here, those very men revealed more composure, patience, and authority than many officers the Hungarians had once followed into war. One incident stayed alive in memory long after. A young Hungarian prisoner, barely 19, collapsed from exhaustion during a work detail repairing a fence. A black sergeant halted the task, crouched down, and handed him water. The boy looked up, stunned, as the sergeant ordered others to give him space. That night, the barracks buzzed with conflicting whispers. Some prisoners mocked the boy for showing weakness. Others replayed the image with unease, an enemy treating one of their own with a compassion their own army had rarely offered. What did such a moment mean for everything they had been taught? The gossip never stopped. Diaries, when not confiscated, filled with scattered notes. Today, a guard greeted us with respect. Why, another entry described how a Hungarian lieutenant froze when a black officer asked him to step aside. He obeyed without thought. Only realizing later what he had done, the contradictions became unbearable. Some men doubled down, insisting America was orchestrating an elaborate performance. Yet others admitted privately that each day chipped away at certainty. Even the smallest gestures unsettled them. A cigarette passed through the barbed wire fence, a chuckle shared at a mistranslated phrase, a soldier offering soap during a wash. Such things did not belong in their world of rigid hierarchies and racial dogma. They belonged to a new reality they could not yet name. The audience may wonder if you were one of those prisoners. Would you have clung to old beliefs or allowed them to be broken? Would a smile have meant more than 1,000 lectures? Tell me in the comments which is stronger, propaganda or lived experience. By the end of the week, many prisoners had stopped speaking with certainty. Silence crept into the barracks where once men had debated politics loudly. Each small act of humanity from the guards weighed more heavily than any punishment. It was not the whip that reshaped them, but kindness. And for men trained to see dignity as their exclusive possession, that realization was more shocking than defeat itself. Night in the barracks was rarely silent. Wooden bunks creaked, boots scraped across the floor, and the low hum of whispers filled the air. This was when Hungarian prisoners gave voice to thoughts they dared not speak in daylight. Rumors swirled like smoke. Diaries confiscated by censors fueled speculation some men wrote bitterly of humiliation. Others described in fascination the quiet confidence of African-American officers. Each page, each whispered retelling, became evidence that something deeper was shifting inside the camp. Arguments flared. One night, a former Hungarian officer slammed his fist against the wall, declaring that America was mocking them, that the presence of black officers was a deliberate insult. Another prisoner, older, more weary, shook his head. "Look around," he murmured. "The Americans follow their orders without hesitation. That cannot be a trick. The barracks fell quiet. Even those who wanted to laugh could not deny what they had seen: authority that transcended race, hierarchy that did not crumble when tested. Small details fanned the fire of disbelief. A prisoner recalled watching a black lieutenant reprimand a white soldier for carelessness, and the white soldier had accepted the correction without protest. To men raised in a world where such an exchange was unthinkable, the memory was haunting. Some tossed restlessly on their bunks, replaying the image until dawn. Others tried to bury it beneath muttered jokes and bravado, but the image lingered, returning again and again like an unwelcome echo. In these late hours, the atmosphere often thickened with unease. Cigarettes burned down to embers as men debated what it meant for their future. Could they return home unchanged, still clinging to old dogmas? After witnessing such contradictions, one soldier, his face half hidden in shadow, admitted he feared what he would tell his children. Would he repeat the lies he had been fed, or confess that he had once saluted a man his country had taught him to despise? Now, I turn the question to you if you were there, inside those barracks. Would you have argued for the old certainties, or whispered about the truth you could no longer ignore? Would you have been the one pounding the wall in defiance, or the one staring into the dark, silent, uneasy? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you think. And so the whispers spread, heavier than chains, more persistent than hunger. They were not whispers of escape or rebellion, but of disillusion for some prisoners. The sight of African American authority was a wound that never closed. For others, it was the first glimpse of a new world. Either way, the silence at dawn carried more weight than the roll calls that followed. Time has a way of dulling sharp edges, yet some memories resist erosion. For many Hungarian prisoners, their first months in American camps became ghostly imprints that followed them across decades. Among the most persistent was the image of African American officers commanding with authority. What had once seemed unthinkable burned itself into recollection, shaping reflections long after the war ended. When peace returned to Europe, most prisoners carried home scars visible and invisible. Families expected tales of hunger, of cruelty, of humiliation. Instead, some men struggled to describe what had unsettled them most, not brutality, but dignity. One former soldier, interviewed in the 1960s, confessed that the moment he first saluted an African-American lieutenant haunted him more than his capture. It had been a salute not just of obedience, but of recognition, a gesture that shattered years of indoctrination in a single instant. Others buried the memory, unwilling to speak aloud of the contradictions they had seen in Cold War Hungary, where new propaganda quickly replaced the old. Such stories rarely found daylight, yet within private diaries, later uncovered by historians. The notes surfaced again and again. One fragment read simply, "The world I believed in ended not with surrender, but with a salute." Another, written decades later, described dreams of camp roll calls where familiar voices gave orders that no ideology could erase. For some, the transformation was quiet but profound. A prisoner who once mocked the sight of black soldiers later admitted to his grandson that the experience forced him to question not only racism, but authority itself. "I learned," he whispered, "that truth does not march in parades. It appears when you least expect it." Such confessions reveal how deeply captivity reshaped them, not just as soldiers, but as men. And yet, not all embraced the change. Others clung to bitterness, convinced that what they had seen was humiliation staged by America. They told their children distorted stories, insisting the camps had been designed to break them with shame. But even in those retellings, the fact of African American command could not be erased. It lingered, a stubborn fact carved into memory, impossible to silence. The symbolic power of those moments endures for the Hungarian prisoners. Defeat was not only measured in battles lost, but in the collapse of certainty. To salute an officer they had been told could never exist was to confront the fragility of the world they had fought to defend. The fences have long since rusted, the barracks rotted into dust. Yet for those who once stood at attention under the orders of African American officers, memory preserved what history might have forgotten. And in that memory lies a lesson that true power is not only measured by weapons or victories, but by the ability to overturn lies with lived reality. History often remembers wars by their battles, their generals, and their treaties. Yet for those who lived through captivity, history was measured in smaller, quieter collisions: a gesture, a command, a single salute. 4 Hungarian prisoners of war. The shock of encountering African-American officers in positions of authority was not a footnote. It was a fracture line that split their old world apart. In the stillness of the camps, far from the fields of Europe, they discovered that propaganda was brittle when pressed against lived reality. They had been told that hierarchy was eternal, that race determined worth, that power had a color, and yet day after day, in barracks and roll calls, in shared cigarettes and reprimands, those illusions dissolved. Authority proved itself not through myth, but through competence. Dignity revealed itself not in theory, but in practice. The rhythm of memory often softens with time, but certain sounds return, for some former captives. The cadence of an African-American officer's commands echoed long after the war, sharper in the mind than artillery, more enduring than speeches. One old soldier, decades later, confessed that he still dreamed of standing in line, hearing orders delivered in a voice that forced him to see the world differently. Such memories linger because they are not only historical, they are personal reckonings that never quite end. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson. Wars destroy bodies, but captivity can destroy certainties, and sometimes from the rubble of certainty. A new understanding is born to those Hungarian prisoners. The war ended not only with surrender, but with a realization the world they fought to preserve had already collapsed. Undone by the authority of men they were never meant to salute.